September 1945. The late summer sun beat down on the flat expanse of Nebraska farmland as a group of 32 Japanese prisoners of war stepped off a military transport truck near the town of Scottsbluff. They had traveled halfway across the world, from the Pacific Islands where they had been captured to the American heartland, expecting labor camps, punishment, perhaps even worse. What they were about to witness would shatter everything they had been told about their enemy. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how a simple farming machine became the catalyst for one of the most profound ideological transformations of the entire conflict, and how the men who saw it would carry that revelation back to a defeated nation, changing the course of their lives forever. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto stood at attention as the American guards removed the chains from his wrists. He was 26 years old, a graduate of the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy, and until 3 months ago he had believed absolutely in the superiority of the Japanese spirit over American material excess. He had been taught that Americans were weak, that they relied on machines because they lacked the discipline and courage of true warriors. The propaganda films shown to soldiers before deployment had depicted a nation of lazy, overindulgent people who would crumble when faced with determined resistance. The reality he had encountered since his capture had been disorienting, but he had attributed it to the specific circumstances of military operations. Surely, he told himself, the abundance of food, the medical care, the seemingly endless supplies were temporary, a facade maintained for propaganda purposes. Japan's military leadership had assured its soldiers that America's industrial capacity was exaggerated, that the images of factories and production lines were Hollywood trickery designed to demoralize Japanese forces. Sergeant First Class Robert Henderson had been managing prisoner of war labor details for 18 months. A farmer's son from Iowa, he had volunteered for military service in 1942, but a childhood injury to his left leg had kept him stateside. He had expected to feel anger toward the Japanese prisoners, perhaps even hatred. His younger brother had been at Pearl Harbor, but the men who arrived at the Nebraska camps were not the savage warriors of propaganda posters. They were hungry, exhausted, and most of all, bewildered. Henderson had been given specific instructions from the camp commander, Colonel William Fitzgerald. The Japanese prisoners were to be treated according to the Geneva Conventions, fed adequately, housed properly, and given work assignments that would benefit the local community while the regular farmhands were overseas. More importantly, they were to be shown, in practical terms, what American society actually looked like. It was an experiment in psychological warfare that relied not on fear but on facts. The prisoners had been assigned to work on 5 different farms in the region. The labor shortage had become critical as the conflict continued, and Nebraska's wheat harvest was essential to feeding not just American troops, but Allied forces across multiple theaters. Private Hiroshi Tanaka, who had been a fisherman before conscription, found himself standing in the middle of a wheat field that stretched to the horizon in every direction. He had never seen so much food growing in one place. The farmer, a man named Ernest Schultz, was 63 years old and had been working this land since he was 12. His 3 sons were all serving in Europe, and his back was not what it used to be. He needed help, and he did not much care where it came from. Through an interpreter, he explained the work schedule. The prisoners would work from dawn until mid-afternoon, with a break for lunch. They would be paid a small wage in camp scrip, which could be used to purchase items from the camp store. They would receive the same meals as the guards. Tanaka listened, waiting for the other rules, the punishments, the impossible quotas. They did not come. Schultz simply walked them to the tool shed, distributed equipment, and demonstrated what he wanted done. That first day, Tanaka worked harder than required, expecting that any sign of weakness would result in consequences. But when the afternoon came, and Schultz called them in for water and rest, he realized something was different here. Lieutenant Yamamoto had been assigned to a different farm, one owned by the Peterson family. James Peterson was a broad-shouldered man of 48, with weathered hands and eyes that crinkled when he smiled. He had lost his son at Guadalcanal, something Yamamoto learned only later. Peterson treated the Japanese prisoners with neither hostility nor excessive friendliness. He treated them like workers, showing them what needed to be done and expecting it to be completed properly. The turning point came on a Thursday morning in early October. The wheat harvest was in full swing across the region, and the prisoners had spent 3 weeks working in the fields, cutting grain with hand scythes and loading wagons. It was back-breaking labor, but the food was plentiful, the accommodations were clean, and the Americans seemed to operate under a system of rules that applied equally to everyone. Yamamoto had begun to question some of what he had been taught, but his fundamental assumptions remained intact. That morning, Peterson drove up to the field in his pickup truck, followed by another vehicle Yamamoto had never seen before. It was enormous, a machine of gleaming metal and complex mechanisms that dwarfed any military vehicle Yamamoto had encountered. Peterson parked and walked over to where the prisoners were working, the interpreter beside him. "This is a combine harvester," Peterson explained. "It cuts, threshes, and cleans the wheat all in one operation. One machine could do the work of dozens of men in a fraction of the time." Yamamoto stared at the massive device. His first thought was tactical. This was clearly a war machine, something designed to intimidate. Perhaps it was a new kind of armored vehicle or a mobile artillery platform disguised as farm equipment. The psychological effect was certainly powerful. The sheer size of it, the evident complexity of its construction, suggested resources beyond anything he had imagined. Corporal Kenji Sato, who had been an engineering student before the conflict, approached the machine with scientific curiosity. He examined the cutting blades, the internal mechanisms visible through access panels, the grain elevator that lifted the harvested wheat into a storage bin. Peterson, seeing his interest, opened the machine fully and began explaining how it worked. Through the interpreter, Peterson detailed the engineering. The combine used a gasoline engine to power multiple systems simultaneously. The header cut the wheat stalks. The threshing drum separated the grain from the chaff. Screens and fans cleaned the grain. The entire process happened continuously as the machine moved through the field. A single combine could harvest more than 40 acres in a single day. Sato translated for the other prisoners, his voice growing quieter as the implications became clear. 40 acres per day. One machine. He did some quick calculations. A good worker with a hand scythe might manage half an acre per day in ideal conditions. This machine was replacing not dozens, but potentially hundreds of workers. And then Peterson said something that changed everything. He explained that this combine was not new. It was a 1941 model, already 4 years old. He explained that these machines were common across American agriculture, that there were thousands of them, that they had been in use for years before the conflict began. This was not a special military development. This was simply how Americans farmed. Yamamoto felt something shift in his understanding. If this was true, if these machines were indeed standard agricultural equipment produced in such quantities that individual farmers owned them, then everything he had been told about American industrial capacity was not just wrong, but catastrophically wrong. The propaganda had not merely exaggerated, it had inverted reality. Peterson started the engine. The sound was deafening, a roar of mechanical power that seemed to shake the ground. Then he engaged the systems, and the combine began to move forward into the unharvested portion of the field. The prisoners watched in silence as the machine advanced, cutting a swath 20 feet wide, wheat stalks disappearing into the header and emerging seconds later as clean grain flowing into the collection bin. In 15 minutes, the combine harvested what would have taken the entire group of prisoners an entire day to accomplish with hand tools. The Americans had been letting them work with scythes, not because combines were unavailable, but because there were not enough combines to harvest everything simultaneously. The prisoners were supplementary labor, not primary labor. That evening, back at the camp, Yamamoto sat with several other officers in the barracks. They spoke in low voices, processing what they had seen. Captain Ichiro Nakamura, who had been a professor of political economy at Kyoto University before conscription, was the first to articulate what they were all thinking. "If the Americans can produce such machines in such quantities for agriculture," he said slowly, "then their military production capacity must be beyond anything our leadership understood. The numbers we were given, the assessments of American industrial strength, they were not just optimistic, they were fantasy. Lieutenant Yamamoto pulled out a small notebook he had been keeping, something the guards allowed. He began writing down everything he could remember about what he had seen at the Peterson farm, the technical specifications of the combine, the casual way Peterson had discussed production numbers, the fact that this was a 4-year-old machine still in perfect working condition, implying not just initial production capacity, but sustained maintenance and parts availability. Over the following weeks, the prisoners began paying attention to everything around them with new eyes. They noticed the trucks that supplied the camps, different models and manufacturers, but all functioning efficiently. They noticed that guards carried watches, that these watches were varied in style and make, implying mass production of even small consumer goods. They noticed the quality of the roads, the electric power lines running to individual farms, the telephone systems that connected rural areas to cities. Private Tanaka, working on the Schultz farm, witnessed another revelation. Schultz received a delivery of spare parts for a tractor, ordered through a catalogue. The parts arrived within 3 days, shipped from a warehouse 600 miles away. Tanaka understood logistics. He had seen how difficult it was to get critical supplies to Japanese forces on remote islands, and here, civilian farmers could order mechanical parts through the mail and receive them in days. The interpreter at the camp, a second-generation Japanese-American named George Takahashi, had initially been viewed with suspicion by the prisoners. He was ethnically Japanese but culturally American, and the prisoners had been taught that such people were traitors to their blood. But Takahashi was patient, and gradually the prisoners began asking him questions. Takahashi explained that there were hundreds of thousands of Japanese Americans living in the United States. He explained that while many had been relocated to internment camps during the early years of the conflict, a controversial policy that many Americans opposed, those who lived outside restricted zones continued their lives, ran businesses, attended schools. He explained that his own parents had immigrated 30 years earlier, that his father had started a small grocery store, that both his brothers were serving in the United States military in Europe. This confused the prisoners more than almost anything else. How could a nation allow ethnic Japanese to serve in its military while fighting against Japan? How could the society be organized around anything other than racial hierarchy and blood loyalty? The answer, Takahashi explained, was citizenship based on shared political ideals rather than ethnicity. It was a concept that required explanation because it contradicted everything the prisoners had been taught about how societies must naturally be organized. In November, as the weather grew colder, the prisoners were given work assignments helping with the corn harvest. This introduced them to another machine, the corn picker, which was somehow even more impressive than the wheat combine. The mechanical ingenuity required to strip ears of corn from standing stalks, husk them, and collect them in a single operation suggested an engineering culture that prioritized efficiency and innovation at every level. Peterson invited several of the prisoners, including Lieutenant Yamamoto, to join him for lunch one afternoon. His wife, Margaret Peterson, served beef sandwiches, fresh bread, vegetables, and milk. The quantity of meat alone would have been remarkable, but what struck Yamamoto was the casualness of it. This was routine, daily fare, not a special occasion. The United States produced so much food that even during a global conflict, civilians ate better than Japanese officers had in peacetime. During that lunch, Peterson told them about his son. Michael had been 19 when he was taken at Guadalcanal. He had been excited to serve, Peterson said, believed in the cause. Margaret Peterson's eyes were red, but her voice was steady. She said she did not hate Japanese people. She hated the conflict. She hated that young men from both nations were being consumed by decisions made by leaders far from the fighting. Yamamoto did not know what to say. In the imperial military, such sentiments would have been considered dangerous, possibly treasonous. Yet here was a woman who had lost her son, speaking not with anger but with grief that transcended nationality. It was profoundly unsettling. By December, the prisoners had been in Nebraska for 3 months. Camp Scottsbluff, officially designated as Prisoner of War Camp 308, housed 800 prisoners, including the original group that had witnessed the combine harvester. Word of what they had seen had spread, and discussions in the barracks became increasingly focused on the implications. Sergeant Henderson had noticed the change in the prisoners' demeanor. They were more thoughtful, less rigid in their interactions. Some had begun asking for English lessons. Others requested newspapers, wanting to understand how American society discussed the conflict. The camp commander had authorized these requests, believing that education was more effective than coercion in achieving long-term objectives. The winter was harsh, colder than anything most of the prisoners had experienced, but the barracks were heated, the food remained adequate, and the Americans provided winter clothing. The contrast with conditions in the Imperial military became more apparent with each passing day. Private Tanaka. In a letter he was allowed to write home, though it would not be sent until after the conflict ended, described the surreal experience of being better fed and housed as a prisoner than he had been as a serving soldier. In January of 1946, after the formal conclusion of the conflict, the prisoners began learning about events they had not known. The atomic devices used against Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the scale of casualties, the unconditional terms of Japanese agreement to end hostilities, the occupation of Japan by American forces. For many prisoners, this news was devastating. Everything they had believed about Japanese military invincibility, about the spiritual superiority that would triumph over material advantages, had been proven absolutely wrong. Some prisoners refused to accept it, insisting it was propaganda, but others, including Lieutenant Yamamoto, recognized the pattern. The combine harvester had been the first crack in the ideological edifice. What followed was simply confirmation of what they had already begun to understand. In March, Ernest Schultz had a conversation with Private Tanaka that would stay with both men for the rest of their lives. Through the interpreter, Schultz explained his philosophy. He said that farming taught you certain truths. You could not harvest what you did not plant. You could not command the weather or the soil. You could work hard or work smart, and working smart meant using the best tools available. You could not win through will alone if your methods were fundamentally insufficient. Schultz said he had never understood the ideology that had driven the conflict. He could not comprehend why any nation would choose to fight against overwhelming material disadvantage. Courage was admirable, but courage without wisdom was simply waste. He said that if Japanese leaders had visited American farms, seen American factories, understood the actual scale of production capacity, they would never have chosen confrontation. Tanaka asked why Americans had not simply demonstrated this capacity before the conflict began, avoiding the entire tragedy. Schultz paused, choosing his words carefully. He said that some things could not be learned through observation alone. People often needed to experience consequences directly before they could accept truths that contradicted their beliefs. It was a failing of human nature, not specific to any nation. The prisoners began preparing for repatriation in the spring of 1946. They would be returning to a Japan they had never known, occupied by the forces they had fought against, transformed from an imperial power into something else entirely. Many were anxious about what they would find. Lieutenant Yamamoto was scheduled to return in April. Before leaving, he asked Sergeant Henderson if he could speak with Farmer Peterson one final time. Henderson arranged it, driving Yamamoto out to the Peterson farm on a Saturday morning. Peterson was working in his machine shed, servicing the combine harvester, in preparation for the coming wheat season. Yamamoto stood in the doorway, watching the farmer work with practiced efficiency, each movement economical and purposeful. Through an interpreter who had accompanied them, Yamamoto thanked Peterson for his treatment over the past months. He said that the experience had been educational in ways he was still processing. He asked Peterson what he should tell people back in Japan about what he had seen. Peterson straightened, wiping grease from his hands. He thought for a long moment. Then he said that Yamamoto should tell them the truth, that Americans were not superhuman, not specially gifted. They were simply people who had built systems that worked, who valued practical results over ideological purity, who believed that the purpose of tools was to make life better and work easier. That the same principles that made American agriculture productive could make any nation productive if people were willing to learn. He said that the combine harvester was not a weapon. It was an example of what was possible when human ingenuity was directed toward creation rather than destruction. He said that Japan could build its own combines, could develop its own industries, could create prosperity for its people if it chose to focus on building rather than conquering. Yamamoto bowed formally in the Japanese manner. Peterson extended his hand in the American manner. After a moment, Yamamoto took it and they shook hands as equals. The repatriation ships departed from Seattle in late April. Hundreds of former prisoners, including all those who had worked the Nebraska farms, made the journey across the Pacific to Yokohama. They carried with them few physical possessions, but a wealth of observations that would influence post-conflict Japanese society in subtle but significant ways. Private Tanaka returned to his fishing village to find it largely destroyed by American air operations. He worked initially as a day laborer, but within 3 years had saved enough to purchase a small motorized boat. Applying principles of mechanization, he had learned watching American farmers. His fishing operation became one of the most productive in the region, and he became an advocate for modernizing Japanese fishing practices. Captain Nakamura returned to Kyoto University, where he completed his academic career. He wrote extensively about economic development and industrial policy, often using examples from his time as a prisoner to illustrate points about the relationship between technology, productivity, and social organization. His work influenced a generation of Japanese economists who would help guide the nation's post-conflict recovery. Lieutenant Yamamoto faced a difficult adjustment. As a former imperial military officer, he was initially viewed with suspicion by occupation authorities, but his documented cooperation as a prisoner and his genuine willingness to embrace democratic reforms eventually led to opportunities. He worked as a translator and liaison officer, helping to bridge cultural gaps between American occupation forces and Japanese civilians. He married in 1949, had 3 children, and lived to see Japan transform into an economic power that would eventually produce agricultural machinery that competed with American brands. In 1978, Yamamoto returned to Nebraska as part of a business delegation examining American agricultural technology. The Peterson farm was still in operation, now run by James Peterson's grandson, who had been born after his Uncle Michael's passing during the conflict. The original combine harvester had long since been retired, replaced by models far more advanced, but the grandson had kept it in a barn, a piece of family history. Yamamoto stood before the old machine, now silent and still, and remembered the morning in 1945 when it had shattered his certainty. He remembered believing it was a war machine, unable to comprehend that such engineering could be devoted to anything other than destruction. He remembered the slow, painful process of understanding how fundamentally wrong his education had been about the world beyond Japan's borders. The combine harvester had been neither kind nor cruel. It was simply a machine, a tool built for a specific purpose, operating according to principles of mechanical advantage that transcended nationality or ideology. But in demonstrating those principles so dramatically, it had accomplished what propaganda and coercion could never achieve. It had forced confrontation with reality. Sergeant Henderson, who had retired from military service and become a teacher, corresponded with several former prisoners over the years. In letters exchanged through the 1950s and 60s, they discussed their wartime experiences with a frankness that would have been impossible during the conflict itself. Henderson wrote about his initial prejudices, his surprise at discovering that Japanese prisoners were neither devils nor supermen, but simply men. The former prisoners wrote about their ideological transformations, the difficulty of reconciling their wartime beliefs with post-conflict realities. One letter from Private Tanaka, written in careful English he had taught himself, described taking his teenage son to see a Japanese-manufactured combine harvester at an agricultural exposition in 1962. He had explained to his son that machines like this had once seemed magical to him, impossible products of a civilization he had not understood. He had told his son that the greatest lesson of his life was that understanding required humility, that ignorance compounded by certainty was the most dangerous combination possible. The farmers of Nebraska who had employed Japanese prisoners spoke little about the experience in the immediate post-conflict years. It was politically complicated, emotionally difficult, and the community was divided about whether it had been appropriate to show such consideration to former enemies. But as decades passed, and perspective lengthened. Many came to view it as a worthwhile experiment in demonstrating values, rather than merely asserting them. Ernest Schultz, in an oral history recorded shortly before his passing in 1973, reflected on his decision to treat the Japanese prisoners as workers rather than enemies. He said that he had been skeptical initially, concerned about security and ideology, but he had come to believe that showing people how ordinary Americans actually lived was more powerful than any propaganda could be. He said the combine harvester had been just a tool to him, but watching the prisoners' reactions had made him see it differently as a symbol of a productive rather than destructive civilization. The story of Japanese prisoners encountering American agricultural technology became a minor footnote in the broader history of the conflict, rarely discussed in official accounts or academic studies. But for the individuals involved, it remained a defining experience, a moment when abstract concepts became concrete realities, when ideological certainties confronted practical facts, and when the future became possible to imagine differently than the past. The combine harvester, that imposing machine that had once seemed like an instrument of conflict to men trained to see struggle everywhere, was simply doing what it had been designed to do, harvesting wheat efficiently in the Nebraska sun, feeding a nation and its allies, demonstrating through its very existence that human ingenuity could be directed toward creation as readily as toward destruction. And perhaps that was the most subversive lesson of all, that the same principles of engineering, organization, and production that could build terrifying instruments of conflict could also build machines that fed millions. That industrial capacity was neither inherently good nor evil, but reflected the purposes to which it was directed. That a nation's true strength was measured not just in its ability to destroy, but in its capacity to create, sustain, and improve the lives of ordinary people. The prisoners who witnessed that demonstration returned to Japan carrying seeds of understanding that would grow in unexpected ways. They became businessmen, teachers, engineers, and civil servants in a nation that would rise from defeat to become one of the world's most prosperous societies. Whether their experience in Nebraska directly influenced that trajectory is impossible to quantify. But those who lived through it believed it mattered, believed that seeing American productivity firsthand had planted doubts about militarism and certainty about the value of peaceful development. The combine harvester stands as a reminder that sometimes the most effective challenges to dangerous ideologies come not from arguments or force, but from simple demonstrations of alternative possibilities. That showing people what life could be like is more powerful than telling them what to think. That technology devoted to improving human welfare creates more lasting change than technology devoted to dominating others. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.